Hi, I'm Jim Heavey from Wood Magazine, and I want to show you how to accurately place and recess the hinges for a slab door like this. We've got a small little closet in here that's actually formed by the direction of the stairs. In this home, they start in the upper right corner and they go down to the left. And it left a potential space that I hated to waste. So we're going to put a little bit of wine in there. So I'm going to call this my wine cellar. And instead of having a plain door in here, I thought maybe this little decorator door would look pretty cool. Well, decorator doors, when you buy them from the home centers, don't come with anything. They're called slab doors. So they don't come with the hinges on here. They don't come with the recesses for those hinges. They also don't come with the bore holes for the lock set on this side. So I want to show you how to accurately, with a router, be able to set up the recess with this hinge. I also want to set this up so that there's a reveal of about 1/8 of an inch at the top of the door. I'll show you how to measure for that. I'll show you how to make the allowances for that. And using a router, I'll show you how to put this in place. The process is actually pretty simple. Let me get this down. I'll get it into my shop and I'll show you how it's done. Well, I've set the door up on a couple of temporary little clamps on the bottom here so that you can kind of see what it is I'm doing. I marked with a piece of tape the face of this door. Sometimes when you put things in your shop and get turned around, you'll wind up putting hinges on the wrong side. So I've kind of marked those right away. I also decided to find out in my other doors in the house about how far down those hinges were. So as I went through and just looked at a couple of the doors in my home, I found that the spacings to the top of the hinge from the door were 8 7/16, 37 3/4, and 67. So to keep my mind wrapped around that, I put a piece of painter's tape on here and actually marked those 3 dimensions on the side of the door. It just makes it a whole lot easier to remember. I also found that what I'm planning on doing is using the same type of hinge that we had in the rest of the house. This hinge is a standard 3-inch hinge, and the edges are slightly rounded here. So what I'm going to do is lay this out on here and use that as my pattern for routing the recess for that particular hinge. Well, if I measure from the top of this door down to those measurements I quoted earlier, the 8 7/16 and 37 3/4 and so on, and I put my hinges in those spots, it just means that the door will be right up against the underside of the jamb, and I don't want that. I want something about 1/8 of an inch away. So to make this a little bit easier, I put a small little spacer here. This is just a piece of poplar with double-sided tape, and it's about 1/8 of an inch thick. So by setting it on the top of the door and now measuring from there, the measurements I get here will automatically provide 1/8 of an inch space at the top of the door, that reveal. That's what I'm looking for. Secondly, when you look at these hinges, there's an awful lot of play in their potential placement. So they can come all the way into the door, they can come out just a little bit. And again, I went to the standard hinge placement in the doors I have in my own home and found out that that offset spacing seems to work pretty well. I wanted a little bit of space in the face here for this to extend so it doesn't touch the trim work, so that the barrel of this hinge clears that piece of trim. So to make these consistent, again with some more double stick tape, I put a small piece of poplar on here, and this automatically gives me my spacing no matter where I move on the door, and it replicates the same spacing I had in the rest of the doors in the home. This way I'm sure that everything is going to fit well. So to start with, I'll take my tape measure and a pencil, and you'll need 6 or 8 of these for this particular project. I'll take my pencil and mark down the 3 places on here where the top of the hinge is going to go. So in this case, we're 8 7/16. So we're going to go here. And again, my tape measure is touching that little block. 37 3/4 is the next one. And 67 is the last. And again, that's to the top of that hinge. And now to lay out each one of these, again, if I take my hinge with my little piece of block on it, my little template, and I put that right up against the edge of the mark I made, I can use my pencil and mark the placement of that hinge. So I know automatically that's going to give me the offset that I'm looking for there. And I'll do this in the middle, and I'll do this at the end. So same thing. Here is my 67, or my 37 3/4. And I'll come down and do my last one here, and that is at 67. Now, one of the methods for cutting these is to use a razor knife and make an outline around this, and then use a chisel to take out as much material as the thickness of this hinge. You can also use a chisel and lightly cut out around the outside edge, and again chisel down into this and across it to provide a recess for that hinge. Both of those methods work. I don't know that they're quite as uniform. I don't think they give you quite as smooth a surface on them. I want something a little bit more perfect. So for that, I'm just going to use a trim router. These are really easy to handle, much easier to control on the edge, and what I've got in here is a small straight bit. And in order to make that bit cut the depth of this hinge, the thickness of this hinge in here, the setup is actually pretty easy. All I need to do is lay that hinge, find a spot where I can get it to touch here. There we go. Lay that hinge on the face of this so that the router bit is even with the edge of that hinge. That way, when I route this, I know that the thickness of that mortise is going to replicate the thickness of that hinge. Process works really well. You can see through here. You can actually kind of watch your bit as it goes. I've drawn the outside edge, and I'm not going to razor knife it yet. I'm going to use the router bit to get as close as I can to those outside edges, and I'll do that on all three. Then I'll come back and razor cut that edge, and then use my chisel to clean it out. This will have made a perfect flat recess on the bottom. Now you can use any router to do that. The trim routers are just a little bit easier to handle. It'd make it easier to kind of balance on the edge of this, but any router would work. So let me get set up at here, get a pair of glasses on and some hearing protection, and I'll show you how this works. Okay, so I've routed around the inside edge, and you can see I've left just a little bit of that pencil line in there. So to go through with this and finish it, I'm just going to use a nice sharp blade of my razor knife and cut down along that pencil line. And again, you don't have to be perfect right off the bat, just kind of get it close and you can trim it later right up to the edge. Okay, so now the base of this has been established. So I can use any kind of a chisel. And again, just be careful while you're doing this. And I'm going to undercut that edge just a bit. Making these cuts makes that undercut work actually pretty well. This is bevel side down. And the same thing across the back. Start in that knife edge. Real slight cut. And I've got an even smaller chisel to do the same thing around the edge. Needless to say, the square-edged hinges are much easier to do than the rounded edge ones. So I guess if you have your options in there, you can kind of take that into consideration. Okay. Now, if I were doing this with a chisel, normally you would cut a bunch of chisel pokes this way and then go in and clean that out, which could give you a fairly flat bottom. But I find that the router does a much better job. Again, a little bit of care around the outside edges, especially as you go up against the end grain, because tear out is a little bit easier there. Needless to say, it doesn't hurt to have a nice sharp chisel. All right, so now that we've got that edge cleaned up, time to fit the hinge. So here we are. And it all but snaps in that opening. So this is a pretty nice look. It's nice and even on the edges. The holes on the inside edge there are spaced inside that door frame, so you won't have any problem with the hold. And when I drill those 3 screw holes, I'll be using a self-centering bit to make sure that those holes are centered in there. So that's how the first one is done. I'll do the other 2. And then lastly, we have to replicate all of that on the door jamb because that needs the same type of thing. And then we'll hang the door. You'll find that it's pretty easy, and using a router makes this a lot simpler still. Well, I finished all 3 of these mortises. Now it's time to put the hinge on. So again, they fit real nicely in that opening. But the idea here is to make sure that the holes that are drilled in the center of each one of these openings allows that screw to sit exactly in the center of that hinge. If the hole is slightly offset, it can pull the hinge when you've tightened it in or out and make it sit kind of askew to the opening, which makes it really hard to get that hinge in there. So what I'm going to use to do that drilling is what's called a self-centering bit. This has got a drill bit inside that collar, and the collar is on a little spring load. And the way that that works is that when the hinge is placed, this self-centering bit fits right inside the edge of that, does not allow any extra movement. So when you press down into this, it puts a hole right in the very center. Okay, so the idea is We're just going to hold the hinge in place and drill each one of these. And now, following it up with a drill bit and a screw, these screws sit right in the very center of that hinge. And keep it from moving left to right. So it makes that hinge sit nicely, it's centered in the opening, and it'll go on with no problem at all. Now it's time to move on to the hole for the lock set, and I'll show you how to do that. Well, now that the hinges are on, the last thing to do on this slab door is to drill the hole that will allow the handset and this plate to go in on the front of it. The process really isn't a real big deal. You're going to get an instruction sheet that comes with the handset. What I found with these is a standard 2 3/8 is a normal back set, how much that knob sits back from the face of this. And fortunately, they provide a little instruction sheet along with a kind of a drilling guide on here. And normally I would cut this off. I'm not going to right now, but I folded it in a spot that it's supposed to go over the edge of the jamb. I'll show you how that works, or at the edge of the door frame. And then what I'll do is show you how to mark those. The drill that we're going to be using is here, and this is called a hole saw. They actually fit onto the end of a drill. This is 2 1/8 inches in diameter, which is what they recommend. In addition to that, to drill for the little striker here, it would be a 1-inch hole saw. And again, whichever handset and striker plate you buy, it's going to determine what those sizes are. Generally speaking, that's about what they are. So I again went back to one of my regular doors in the house, measured from the top of the door down to the middle of where my normal handsets are set. And that was at about 41 inches. So I put a little line at 41 inches. So if I take this little template and I fold it where it suggests and lay it out so that the line here lines up on the scribe line that I put in at about 41 inches. I can use it all and poke a hole in the start. Again, that's at the 2 3/8. And on the side, it'll show for the thickness of this particular door slab. So they make these for interior doors and for exterior. So now I've got my 2 marks, both on the top and on the side. And to use these drills, they do have a pilot bit in them. I'll start it in the hole. I know when the drill is plumb and square to this, when the cut is even all the way around when I start. The big key is this does not have an awful lot of room for sawdust. So take your time when you're cutting it. Pull it out occasionally to relieve some of these edges of the sawdust that's in there. Otherwise, it's going to bind and burn. And when this tip finally pierces the back side, stop what you're doing, turn this over, and use this on the back side. If I continue to press down, there's a real good chance that these teeth, being a little bit more coarse, will just blow the back out of that door. Now, most of the plate on here will probably cover it, but you're much better off to drill most of the way until this drill bit shows on the other side, and then stop and come back. So I'll show you how to start this. And again, what we'll do is we'll just show you the idea, and then I'll finish this off camera. Again, notice how that sawdust really builds up on the edge here, and continue to clear that, and your bit will run a lot cooler. As it goes deeper into the door, it does build up an awful lot more sawdust. So I can feel I'm through on the other side. Once I've done that, I'm going to stop, turn this over on the other side and finish up the hole. Once I've done that hole, I'll change the hole saw here to 1 inch. That goes in from the side directly through the center of this, and that allows my latch mechanism to go in. And that's really all there is to that door. So I'm going to finish this up and I'll throw it in the opening. So this is our completed door. Now I used the palm router and that method of setting the depth of that bit for 3 different recesses. The first was the hinges. The second, which required a slightly deeper recess, was for the lock recess here, that latch mechanism. And lastly, a little bit thinner one for the strike plate. The process was actually pretty easy and the technique I showed you worked really well. So I think that the next time you're thinking about recessing anything, think about that technique, because after all, this is the fit that you want.